Thanks for joining us today for Jennifer South and Associates in our Webinar Wednesday program. We are coming to you live from Washington, D.C. Our webinars are every Wednesday and are provided complimentary. They're recorded and can be downloaded from our website and YouTube channel, which now holds over 300 of our government contracting webinars. In the interest of time, we do not take questions, so if you have questions for our speaker, we will have his information on the last slide of the presentation today. A special thanks to our educational sponsor, the National Veteran Small Business Coalition, for making these webinars possible. The NVSBC is the largest nonprofit trade association for veterans. Please visit their website for more information. Okay, now a little bit about us. We work with U.S. federal government contractors, including product, service, and software firms. Our services range from market analysis reports to contract vehicles and compliance. More information is on our website. We also have opportunities for your organization to advertise in our newsletter. We now reach almost 17,000 subscribers, and this includes both contractors and government. Contact us for pricing information with the email shown on your screen. Okay, and now to introduce our speaker, Eric Crucius. Welcome, Eric. We are glad to have you here with us today, and I'll turn the floor over to you.
Great. Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to talk for a few minutes about OTAs. I specifically like these webinars because they require the lawyers speaking to be brief, which is really hard for lawyers to do. Appreciate that exercise that we go through in order to do these webinars. Our topic today is OTAs, and if we go to the next slide, we're going to do kind of a facts versus myths on OTAs, because I think there's a lot of misconceptions out there about the nature of OTAs, how they work, what they all mean, how to get them, all that kind of stuff. So I thought we'd cover some of those kind of more prevalent facts and myths that are out there for OTAs. If we go to the next slide, you'll see just a really brief introduction. I know this whole month is OTA month, essentially, on these webinars, but I know not all of you have probably tuned into all the webinars that have happened so far, so I thought I'd do kind of a brief introduction to get folks up to speed on what OTAs are. So what are they? So as you can see, they're kind of defined by what they are not better than what they are. So they're not a traditional contract that you see in the context of a FAR and DFARS contract or other agency regulations in there. They're not covered by the traditional guardrails that you see in government contracts. So there's not a termination for convenience clause necessarily in your OTA, whether you've negotiated it or not. One thing that we'll talk about later on in the webinar, a few minutes from now, is that we can't rely on those FAR, DFARS, and other agency provisions that we expect to see in a contract to protect us, because believe it or not, some provisions in the regulations are there to protect contractors, especially with IP, and you don't have those protections necessarily. And there's also statutes like the Competition and Contracting Act that allow for certain things to happen with respect to protests and contracts. Again, that's not something that's in there. So you're really starting with a blank slate. So if you look at the next bullet point, an OT is a transaction to which most laws and regulations concerning government contracts do not apply. So it's not a government contract, it's not a grant, it's not a cooperative agreement. It is a legally enforceable contract, but it's not the term of art government contract where you have all that stuff that's placed upon it. And obviously, a lot of you have heard about the Section 809 panel, which was from the NDAA a couple of years ago. They made recommendations about how to speed up the procurement process because the warfighter was not getting the materials and services that they needed in a timely manner. And this was a way, this kind of the expansion of the use of OTAs is a way to kind of combat that and not be stuck with the traditional regulatory requirements that contractors have to jump through and the contracting agencies have to jump through in order to get kind of materials in the hand of the warfighter. So, I mean, that being said, as we'll see in one of the myths ahead, that OTAs have been around for a while, but they've recently been expanding, especially on the DoD front. But OTAs are still government contracts. They're still contracts, but they're not government contracts. And because they're still contracts, they still can be legally enforceable under certain circumstances. But they kind of bend that line. And I will say that there is not a ton of law out there on the nature of other transactions and how enforceable they are. So you too one day can be a trailblazer if you have an issue with an OT agreement. As it says here, the statutes such as the Contract Disputes Act and the Competition and Contracting Act do not apply. So it's very interesting. It's kind of wide open, and it's more acts like a commercial enterprise than a government enterprise when you enter into an other transaction agreement with the government. The final point here is kind of one that we've already touched on a little bit, in that each term that is in an OT agreement must be negotiated. So you're starting with a blank slate. There's not going to be FAR and DFARS clauses in there or other agency clauses in there. That being said, the government may try to will some of those in, and their opening negotiating point may be to have those in there. If you look through agency guidance, most agencies have a guide. Most agencies which have OT authority have a guide for their contracting folks, and it's usually available to the public, about what they want to see in their OT agreements. And lo and behold, a lot of the things that they want to see in their OT agreements is similar to what is in government contracts, which kind of defeats the purpose somewhat of OT agreements. Another thing that I find striking with how the whole system is set up is that you'll find that each agency that has OT authority has different kinds of authority by statute, and also has different negotiating ploys and different requirements. It's really kind of a fractured marketplace, which actually makes things more complicated. I mean, as a lot of you probably remember, the idea behind the federal acquisition regulation was to smooth out the differences between the agencies. And then we got, of course, agency-specific regulations, which kind of took some of that smoothing away. In this OT process, it's kind of a little bit more of a degradation of that smoothing process, because you have agencies that have remarkably different requirements, have remarkably different authority. So if you're going to, if you enter into, let's say, an OT agreement with the Department of Defense, and you want to do the same thing at NIH, you might have a different, totally different experience, because what the guides and the permissibilities are for NIH are completely different than what they are from DoD. So it does vary quite a bit from agency to agency. So that's kind of my 5-minute overview on OTAs. I will also just mention there are a number of specific initiatives out there. A lot of you probably heard of DIU-X, which is now DIU, Defense Innovation Unit, that's run by DoD out of Austin and Boston and the Pentagon. And of course, there are a number of different initiatives across the government. So if you're interested in OT agreements, I know last week or the week before we covered consortiums. Look into consortiums and look into these different specific initiatives of where you might want to do business with the federal government if you think you have an innovative product or service that can fit under the constraints of what the agency is allowed to do. And let's go on to the next slide. So this is a kind of a chart. A lot of times before a presentation, we have an agenda. This presentation obviously is kind of short. We're only at about 20 minutes or so. So instead of an agenda, I thought we'd kind of lay out what we're going to talk about. And these are kind of some myths and facts on OTAs. And you can see the first myth that we're going to cover is that any federal agency can enter into an OTA. The second myth that I've heard actually around the community is that DoD's OTA authority is new. It's actually been around for quite some time. The third one is that OTAs can't be protested. They actually can, but under more limited circumstances. The next one is that FAR and DFARS clauses can't be in OTAs. They actually can be, but it's not necessary. And contractor IP is automatically protected in an OTA, and that's just not the case, unfortunately. So we're going to dive through each one of these, spend a few minutes on each one, and kind of get us through the webinar to the end. And let's go to the next slide. So the first myth, that any federal agency can enter into an OTA, is not true. I have this handy-dandy chart here that shows the different OTAs. OTAs are only permitted if they're permitted by a particular statute passed by Congress, signed by the President. So we have two slides here that kind of cover the waterfront on that. The first one is the DoD requirements. You can see here there's two separate DoD authorities. 1989 and 1994 are when the DoD started getting OTA authority. And it was very quiet for more than 20 years or so until more recently, and we'll explain more in the next slide or two. And then you have the Department of Energy, which is somewhat more recent OTA authority, RPE, which got OTA authority just in the last decade or so. NIH has a very fractured OTA authority history. As you can see there, there's different statutes that have allowed NIH to have OTA authority, and each one provides for a different kind of authority for covering different subject matters. It's not that an agency is given OTA authority and they can enter into OTAs on anything they want. Oftentimes it's limited by a particular kind of subject matter. You can see with DoD's authority, the first it started with in '89 was for research R&D projects, and then after that it was prototype projects, and they each have their own requirements. If we go to the next slide, we can see the rest of them. Department of Homeland Security, DHS, which obviously was not around before 2002, so their OT authority came online pretty soon after, if not contemporaneous with the establishment of the department itself. And then you have a few others here, DNDO, TSA, again, I believe TSA which is under DHS, came online soon, right around that time. DOT in '98, FAA in '96, and NASA, which started this whole OTA trend in 1958. So they've had OTA authority for quite a number of decades. They use it a little bit differently because it's under the Space Act. And we'll say that the last myth is actually not in the chart, but it will be explained on the last slide. It's kind of more of a fun myth than anything else, but I'll explain kind of the NASA Space Authority, Space Act OTA authority with that last slide. So let's go to the next myth, and that DoD's OTA authority is new. And it's actually not new. As you saw from that chart, it's been around for 25 years. What has happened, though, in the last few years of the National Defense Authorization Act, and for the uninitiated, of course, the National Defense Authorization Act is not just the statute that's passed every year that funds the military. They also lay out a number of regulatory requirements and how acquisitions should work kind of requirements, which then kind of get translated into regulations, and those regulations become FAR clauses sometimes. But sometimes it doesn't go that far because it's not necessary with respect to especially these kind of OTA authorities that we see for DoD. So why have we seen this recent kind of explosion of other transactions in the DoD marketplace? And the answer is because the NDAA has expanded DoD's authority recently and raised monetary ceilings as well. So it's really given the incentive to DoD to use OTAs. That being said, OTAs are still a very small percentage of contracting that occurs. It's a significant amount of money, of course, but it's still quite a small percentage overall. So DoD is kind of looking to expand that percentage and raise it up and get things to the warfighter in an even quicker manner than is now. I mentioned the Section 809 panel, which was the panel, like I said, established by the NDAA to look at contracting, and it's made up of contracting professionals who made recommendations in 3 separate full reports and a summary report. And their conclusion was we needed to do more things, very high level, of course, like OTAs to kind of streamline the acquisition process. So to that end, in 2016 NDAA, and this is in Section 815, certain approvals are required to use OTAs, and those approval levels were raised significantly. You see it went from 20 million to 50 million in one instance, and 100 to 250 million in another, depending on the type of work that's being done. It also broadened the definition of what's called a non-traditional defense contractor. That's important because under the OT authority, there were certain advantages that non-traditional defense contractors had with respect to the ability to utilize OTAs on their own. And that because that definition expanded, there was a much wider breadth of contractors that were able to take advantage of the OT process at a higher dollar threshold. Also, for certified cost and pricing data, it was that no contracts, the contractor who wanted to utilize the OTA couldn't have in excess of $500,000, no contracts in excess of $500,000, which certified cost and pricing data was required. And now they had to have no contracts that were subject to full cast coverage in the past year. So that also loosened the requirement under the non-traditional defense contractor definition. So if we go to the next slide, also in 2016 in the same section, it has streamlined the authority, as it says there, to award these follow-on contracts. So it gave folks more flexibility to do that. This second point was pretty significant. If competitive procedures were used for the initial prototype project, then a sole source contract could be had at the end of that. And that was very attractive, obviously, to contractors. You have a competitive procedure, you get the prototype award, and then when it moves to production where the real money could be, you have a sole source contract. Obviously very attractive to contractors and pretty attractive to the agencies as well. Of course, folks who lost out in the initial competition don't like it very much, but it makes things very efficient. As well, one other thing I want to point out, though, is that they had to, if you participated as a consortium member, you met this requirement, and also the OTA contractor needed to successfully complete the prototype project. And we'll talk about a protest that in a few slides, but that's a sticking point. In order to get the production work, you have to complete the prototype project. So you can't kind of get 2/3 of the way through or do parts of the prototype project. You know it's going to be successful. You want to do the production work. The government wants to do the production work. Can't do the production work yet under this regulation because you have to completely finish the prototype project. Let's go to the next slide. So then we move on to 2018. A very significant first point here that DoD has a preference for OT agreements for science and technology prototyping projects. So the idea is that DoD is supposed to look to OT agreements first, not traditional contracts first, when utilizing science and technology prototyping projects. Also, those dollar thresholds we talked about in 2016 have now been raised to $100 million and $500 million before approvals are necessary, certain approvals. Also, follow-on production contracts can be awarded to consortia of industry and academic institutions. So it, again, expanded the ability of non-traditional contractors and even some traditional contractors to be awarded follow-on production contracts, which again is where the money is when you're talking about OTAs. So let's go to the next slide. And we go to 2019 now. This actually, I apologize, this should be 2020 NDA this year. And it requires DoD to produce quarterly reports to Congress on the use of OTAs. Congress is obviously a little reticent to be giving all this money away, not giving it away, but giving it to contractors in exchange for a product or service. Without oversight, we don't have a real protest process in place to protect what's happening. And folks can complain about the protest process, but as one of my partners likes to say, it's a contractor paid for audit, essentially, of a procurement, and we don't have that for the most part with OTAs. So I think those quarterly reports are probably a good idea just to kind of monitor, see what's going on. Here's the second point, which is really an answer to a protest that happened. It clarifies that the follow-on production within a consortium can happen even if the prototype project is not completely complete. So if there are aspects of the prototype project that are still going on, then that's okay, as long as the part of the prototype project that is the subject of the production work has been completed, then you can proceed with the production. So it does not require every element of the prototype project to be done before advancing to production, as long as the production part is not the part that is being has not been completed yet. So, and it also allowed OTAs for personal protective equipment. which is an area that a lot of contractors are involved in. So there's a lot of potential opportunity there to get OT contracts for personal protective equipment. I didn't put the section on this one because that's pulled from a bunch of different sections. So let's go to the next slide for a new myth. OTAs can't be protested. That's actually, the fact is actually that OTAs can be protested in limited circumstances. So when a protest is filed, usually it's filed because we think that an agency made an incorrect decision as a protester. And that aspect of an OT agreement where on the merits of the product or service that's offered, the agency made the wrong decision, that's not protestable. But what is protestable is how the agency is using its OT authority. If it's not using its OT authority properly, and as a result, the contract has been awarded improperly, then that can be protested. The classic example of that was a protest by Oracle against Ring Cloud. So what happened was that Ring Cloud got a prototype project, then they got a production contract for $950 million. So as you can see here, Oracle was not protesting a competitive process, but whether the agency had the right to make the award in the first place. So, and GAO actually sided with the protester here with Oracle and said that the follow-on award was improper because it did not allow for it and the prototype was not completed. So there's two grounds there. The first was that the prototype project was not completely completed, so they couldn't move to production yet. And the initial award did not contemplate a production contract after the fact, so the agency couldn't come back and use the OT authority to then retroactively essentially add in a production contract vehicle. So all that being said, you can sometimes protest OT agreements, but you can't protest, let's just say there was a competition for providing these cloud services that Oracle and Ring Cloud both applied for, and the agency used its OT authority properly, but Ring just won out and the agency picked Ring. Oracle couldn't protest that. They could only protest the method of how the OT authority is being used. And that's kind of what that stands for. So long story short, there are protests available, just not based on the merits of each opposing proposal. Let's go to the next one. This one is a fairly common one, is that the FAR and DFARS clauses can't be in OTAs. They actually can if the parties agree. So here you have a circumstance where we're back in kind of commercial contract world instead of government contract world, where the parties can negotiate against each other and decide to put in clauses. And sometimes those clauses can actually be FAR and DFARS clauses that are in a contract. The world is your oyster when negotiating an OTA with an agency, in theory at least, where the parties can actually just agree to put in whatever they want as long as they think it's for the best interest of the parties. There are, of course, exceptions to that, but for the most part, those common terms you see in government contracts are all up for negotiation. That doesn't necessarily mean you'll get a better deal than if you used a traditional contract. Again, it depends how good of a negotiator, I guess, that you are, or what is your priority. So as it says here, there's no mandatory FAR or other regulatory provisions in the agreements. The parties can agree. But the second point is kind of important to remember, and kind of the reality of where we are, is that agencies all have guidance documents about what their agencies are expecting to see in their OT agreements. And that may be some FAR and DFARS or other agency clauses, or it could be new initiatives like CMMC. As probably a lot of you heard, there's going to be a new cybersecurity certification requirement beginning in June for RFIs and September for RFQs. And it may be that DoD says, we're not going to award any OTs unless the company has a CMMC certification at a level we think is appropriate. So it may be that there are no legal requirements, but that the government won't negotiate without certain clauses or terms being in a government contract. And for clarification, there are no DFARS CMMC clauses just yet, but they do expect to have proposed and final regulations done by the third quarter of this year. Let's go to the next slide. Contractor IP is protected in OTAs. That is not true. So as much as we kind of, on the contractor side, kind of complain about the FAR and DFARS clauses being in contracts, they're kind of like a blanket. They protect us sometimes as a contractor, at least anyway. And we don't, as a contractor, you don't have those automatic protections in your OT agreements. The IP terms have to be negotiated. So some things to think about when negotiating an IP agreement within an OTA is what IP rights, this is very basic, but what IP rights do you want the government to have? If something is created, if the company is bringing IP to the OT and to the matter, do you want the ability of your competitors to see this IP? Things, whether it's marked or not, right? So if you haven't marked your IP, does that mean you forfeit all rights to it? If there's some follow-on work that the company is not performing, what rights will the follow-on contractor have to be able to look at the IP? So there's all kinds of things to think about like that. Usually I find that IP ends up very consistent with what the FAR and DFARS is, and kind of a flavor of whoever paid to develop the IP has a right to the IP. So if the contractor brings the IP to the arrangement, then the contractor maintains control over the IP as long as there's enough IP there to perform the work that the government expects to be performed. On the other hand, if the government has paid for the IP, the contractor will forfeit a lot of rights to that IP. They may still have the right, certain rights, such as a paid-up license to use it, worldwide, or maybe they give that license to the government. But usually, the government has a right to the IP and can share the IP with other contractors as well. So, something to be wary of with OT agreements is that the IP may be forfeited. So we're on to the last OTA myth on the next slide, and that is that OTAs are boring. A lot of people say that government contracts is not the most exciting thing. I actually find it very fascinating because things are always changing and things are really interesting. But here's an example of a piece of an OTA between NASA and a production company under the Space Act. And it's pretty cool. You can see here that NASA essentially kind of leased out its space in order for BBC's series Top Gear to film at a NASA facility. So OTAs kind of sometimes can bring about some really cool things. So if you see a movie that's been filmed at a NASA facility, one day you'll know there was probably an OTA agreement behind it that allowed that filming to occur. I think this was if my memory serves me correctly, this was a no-cost OTA where neither party exchanged dollars for it. But the NASA uses their OTAs sometimes a little bit differently than you would think traditionally, where they rent out their facilities and things like that. It's an easy vehicle for them to do that under the Space Act. So just like everything else in government contracting, for the most part, there's a lot of nuance, and that makes it quite interesting. And we go to the next slide. And that wraps it up for us over here on OTAs, and I'll hand it back to the folks running the webinar.
Thank you, Eric, for a great presentation and sharing your time with us. Thanks to everyone who joined us. The recording will be on our website and YouTube channel within the next 24 hours. Please join us this Friday as we cover each part of the FAR, and join us next Wednesday for more hot topics in federal contracting.